Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. I'm Craig Jeffery, your host for today's episode. Today's episode is called Career Accelerators and Pathways, and I'm joined by Elisabeth Constantin, who's the head of ABREO, an executive outplacement and transition services firm.
Thank you for having me.
And by Royston, Costa, the assistant treasurer of Ferguson.
Hey, Craig. Nice to be on here.
Well, it's good to have you here for the first time, Elisabeth. Royston, I'm not sure how many podcasts we have. I think we'll need to include information in the show notes so that people can listen to all of our conversations. Let's begin talking about career accelerators and profile diversification. Elisabeth, maybe you could begin first answering what those are. I mean, treasury people, finance people tend to think of hard skills more than career accelerators and profile diversification and breaking into new networks. Maybe you could start us off describing and giving us a definition of what those terms mean.
So with my business, we support a lot of executives and senior executives. A lot of them are in treasury and in finance. So controllers, treasurers, heads of accounting, CFOs. And if we talk about career diversification for treasury professionals, there is, at a certain point in their career, for those who have C-suite aspirations and want to make it into the C-suite, we see a good bit of skill set diversification in the finance space at some point. And that could typically happen at 3 points in a person's or a treasury professional's career. At the more earlier level, so treasury manager level, where sometimes experience like FP&A or controllership could get added, more at the mid-level, where we would see branching out into more like finance director roles, where they would also oversee FP&A and then accounting, more business strategy. There could be opportunity to branch into investor relations or regional or business unit CFO roles. And then, of course, later at the career where someone could become, if they max out at the larger company level, there could be opportunities to branch out into CFO roles in smaller companies or smaller divisions, or chief accounting officer, VP finance roles, in addition to board and advisory positions. And obviously, treasurers who have those kind of C-suite aspirations at some point need to diversify a little bit in the finance space. And it probably makes sense that if they do that along the way, a little bit by playing in different sandboxes, it gives them access to different networks, different opportunities, and career paths that don't put them into just the treasury box.
You described three ways, and in my head I was filtering in this way. Maybe you could help get my head straight. One is this rotational view. As I moved to some different areas in finance to build that more comprehensive or well-rounded view, right? FP&A, treasury, accounting. Or the other is maybe I go deep in a particular area, but then maybe I shift to another company and a smaller company perhaps, and so I have to wear a lot more hats.
Yes, it's that, and it's both. Because yes, it's playing in more sandbox, diversifying. Like you can make a great career, a great specialist career in treasury and never branch out. But if you have those C-suite aspirations, a lot of treasury executives get there through the CFO route. So you have to build up that finance experience along the way, which you can do it during several points in your career, early, mid-level, or later. And then it's also, if you hit a roof in the ceiling in a company from a treasury perspective, in a large company, you're not just going to immediately get the VP finance role. So maybe it's worth at that point taking a look at some smaller companies that might give you that opportunity to play in that sandbox.
Excellent. Yeah, the hybrid, those two options plus the hybrid, that seems really good, Elisabeth. Royston, on this topic, treasury tends to be focused maybe more technically. I know there's been more conversations about soft skills. How do you think about this area?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting today. I've seen so much evolution in treasury for good, and I think this is what I'd like your listeners and your viewers to hear from where I'm sitting. And that's why I think what Elisabeth has to offer is so relevant to treasurers. I'm going to say a few things that might make you smile because, of course, I'm biased. I believe Treasury has been vastly underrated, vastly undervalued, and we ourselves do not pay enough attention to our careers, in terms of our roles. Historically, Treasury has always been very incestuous in the sense that, your aspiration, when I suddenly joined this profession, was only ever going to be group treasurer. There was no other opportunity or kind of aspiration that you were shown that you could aspire to. If you look at finance, for example, which is our nearest cousins, if you like, in terms of profession, they have a vast array of routes that are well trodden and certainly lead up to CFO, C-suite, executive level. My view is that what we're seeing today, certainly, and I've got I know a few people that have achieved this, is treasurers are achieving C-level suite positions, CFOs, CEOs, but more importantly, and this is what's changed in the period that I've been around as treasurer, is you've had the economic crisis 2008 as an example. You had the recent pandemic. It's unfortunate, but it's taken a crisis in a lot of cases for boards and companies to recognize the value of treasurers. And one last thing I'm going to add, which is, it's my experience in most companies, or at least in the company I work for, that when a CFO typically is looking for someone they can rely on to take on a task or a project that no one else in the company is ideally or necessarily equipped to take on, they turn to their treasurer. So typically we are the ones that are looked at to be, whether you like to call it a safe pair of hands or just that party, that stakeholder that most CFOs feel they can trust, because we also have to very often think outside the box, as you know. But yeah, we're in a situation now in the world today where I do believe the world's your oyster for treasurers.
Interesting. Yeah. Thanks for those comments. Elisabeth, you talked about some of the diversification, within a company or between companies, or a combination of those. When we were prepping, you talked about the concepts about breaking into new networks. Maybe you could talk about that as well. What do you mean when you say breaking into new networks? Why should we care about that?
I would say because there is sometimes a history for treasurers to get placed in that box of treasury. There are other ways to add more experiences and revenue streams to their career. Obviously, it could be by going into the C-suite through the CFO route that Royston was also referencing is becoming more common. But another layer could be to add board service into a person's career portfolio. And that's often interesting to treasurers when they do hit that internal career ceiling with their organization. For treasury professionals in particular, it's obviously interesting to look at boards, for example, in the payments industry, right? Companies in the payments industry, or with really any other service provider that does sell services to corporate treasury departments, because those businesses would benefit greatly from the customer perspective of the treasurer. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to get involved. And I would say that, we could probably make that topic a whole session in and of itself on how to get there and how to break in. But for us as a business, so we serve a lot of executive treasurers who are looking for progression and advancement. So when we optimize their resumes and their LinkedIn for the executive search process, the topic on how do I get on a board often comes up. And there are two important factors to that. One is education and the other one is timing. Education, really, to know how boards function and govern is really the key. It's the most important substitute for not already having board experience. So our recommendation is to get educated on how boards work. And if it's something that someone wants to pursue, it would be to get formally credentialed, which would give them credibility and exposure to a network of established directors. And the other piece is timing. Building up networks is highly valuable, but does take time. So the key here in today's modern world, like Royston said, a lot of things are moving quickly. The key is to start this journey early, because we know that it takes about 1 to 5 years to find your first paid board seat. 80% of first board seat holders get it to their network. So the key here is to start at the director or VP level and not wait until you're retired to where you get that retirement stamp on your forehead and then you're a less desirable candidate. So I would say, if I had to summarize it, it is another sandbox to play in that could add another layer of experience and revenue stream for treasurers, not just in parallel to their careers, but also after their careers. So with that, it does make sense to build that up earlier.
Yeah. The 1 to 5 year time frame seems logical. So education and timing. Now, Royston, I know another area for breaking into new networks or diversifying or strengthening the background is being in academia or having a speaker profile or speaking. I know you do some of that. You do some classes you teach on in some different areas. And plus, you bring us about a fifth of our ideas for the podcast. So maybe you could touch on how you think about that area.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to comment on something that Elisabeth said, which I agree with in principle. But there's a couple of things I think we need to recognize. It's been widely talked about. For the first time in human history, we are going to have 5 generations in the workplace. And why that's important is because we've also got an aging population on one hand, but we've also got a population or a young workforce that's coming into the workplace that are not reproducing at the same rates that the boomer generation, the previous generation reproduced. So again, why is that important? There's going to be a shortage, in my view, of not only workers, but if that aging workforce, the workforce supposed to retire, actually does retire, there's going to be a whole drain in knowledge, in my view, from the workplace. So these are actual factors that not just I'm thinking about, but if you look at some of the articles on the internet and globally, some of the governments the Japanese government is actively considering how they're going to address the shortage in the workforce. It's important. Why is that also important? In terms of what Elisabeth said is, as much as I think you're right, Elisabeth, about the fact that we should wait till you get to retirement to look at a board position, probably less desirable. I think there is an element where there will be still a requirement for people with experience, particularly if there's not enough in that workspace at the moment. My view is that you have to have a broad cross-section anyway, because one of the things I've looked at in terms of people used to talk about mentors being someone typically older who has more experience. Actually, it works the other way as well. So I met someone, don't remember who they was, a very well-accomplished speaker, who said their mentor was a 29-year-old female, for that matter. And not that matters, but I think it does in a world where we're looking at DI and so on and so forth. But the point he was making is that he's looking for someone like that to inspire him and to make him aware of the challenges in today's world. Very quickly, to answer your question about the broader side of what I've come across and what I'm doing. So I'm a senior lecturer on a course that's run by CFTE, and they run a course on the impact of generative AI on treasury. And, again, this came through part of the networking exercise that I had with the ACT, the Association of Corporate Treasurers in the UK, and something I'm looking actually to partner with the AFP here in the US. But for me, treasury is about networking. One of the reasons I got into treasury is because it means working with people, and every day is different. And that's what's exciting. The only thing I would say is in the past, it wasn't so possible or it wasn't feasible for treasurers to look outside of their area because there wasn't a recognition or credibility necessarily that we have today. So I do believe that the future is very exciting for treasury. And I'm quite keen to try and encourage certainly younger entrants into the industry and try to demolish some of the myths that treasury has about being boring or not being, an area that kind of you can aspire to becoming a CFO or even, maybe even a CEO.
The 5 generations in the workplace, that's sticking in my head as there is going to be that overlap of those age cohorts. Maybe we could do introductions, a little more formal introductions. Elisabeth, maybe you could start, just describe a little bit about your career, what your role is at ABREO, and then we'll do the same with Royston. And then I probably have a few follow-up questions on those too.
Yeah, certainly. So ABREO is an executive services and transition provider. So we help executives who want to or have to make a move in their career. Either they want to go from director to VP or VP to president or president into C-suite. And what we do for them is we holistically prepare them for their market re-entry and market transition. So we very assertively position their resumes for the demands at the next level, including the financials that they would want to highlight to show the value and the impact of their work. We update their LinkedIn profiles to make it more attractive to recruiters, executive headhunters, board directors, C-suite, hiring managers. And we also provide a lot of consulting for executives on how to really navigate the executive search space, because finding a job in the hidden job market at the upper levels is very different from how you look for a job at the middle management levels. So we provide the consulting around that. And we also advise them on topics like general negotiation, like how and why should you negotiate your severance on the way in after at a certain level? And how and why should you maybe consider lining up legal for your next negotiation process with regards to like non-competes and being able to take those coveted board seats that you may want to pursue so you can negotiate that ability in. So that's what we do. We do that for executives as private clients, and we also do it at the company corporate level. So if a company ends up terminating an executive and they want to ease the transition, then usually our services are provided as part of the severance package. My own background is that I was in HR for about a decade, always very focused on supporting executives, whether it was through compensation or other HR roles. I always had that kind of line of sight. And then 4 years ago, decided to go out on my own and focus just on supporting executives in transition.
You know, there's career coaches, or there's, you know, people can hire professional coaches. It sounds like there's certainly some differences there between a professional coach, right? You know, I always think of the early days was like, hey, have someone help you write a resume. And then there's the career coach or professional coach that helps you do better and more effective. And your role is different than a career coach.
Yeah. So I don't coach people on how do you get from a junior analyst in finance to become a CFO. What skill set, experience do you need? Like, I know that, but it's not really the work I provide. Nor do I really step in on if someone gets a 360 review and gets some constructive criticism on some of their soft skills. I don't necessarily coach them out of that. It may come up, but it's not the key service. Like, my work is really to get executives ready for market, for those transitions, whether it's promotion, stealth search, putting themselves out there. My job is to get them ready and then help them get out there and protect their downside on the way.
Excellent. Royston, could you just do an intro as well, and maybe touch on the relevance of all of this for Treasury?
So my role currently is I'm the assistant treasurer for the UK at Ferguson, who are obviously a leading distributor of plumbing and heating products based in North America, in Virginia. I'm responsible for the treasury technology and the UK intercompany loan structure, as well as providing support to our US Treasury team on some of the more strategic transactions. I've been in Treasury for 37 years. I started my career working for a merchant bank in the city of London. And then I moved on to a finance company until I reached my first Treasury role for a company called B, which is now Sky today. After Sky, joined Gillette and learned lots about international Treasury. And bear in mind, these were in the days where we didn't have the internet. So it was quite interesting and challenging having to liaise with some of the operations they had in the Caribbean and some other exotic areas using a simple telephone line. After Gillette, I joined a company called Polygram, which is a music company that got acquired by Seagram's, a wines and spirits company, who then sold it off to Vivendi Universal, which is the company it is today. But that was just before I joined Ferguson. By the time I joined Ferguson, the company was called Wolseley because they had originated in the UK. And then in 2017, we decided to change the name to Ferguson because Ferguson was our largest subsidiary. So I've been with Ferguson 23 years this year, actually. I've done various roles within Treasury. And, you know, sort of today's, let's say, my role as an assistant treasurer. And I'm always kind of, you know, looking in terms of making myself aware what's out there and what potential opportunities, even like Elisabeth's alluded to about board membership or non-executive board membership. I think it's an important aspect of a treasurer's potential career. No, it's not for everyone, but I think we do have a natural skill set, particularly in terms of cybersecurity today, to add some real value to a lot of boards.
The diversification that Elisabeth talked about, either maybe moving around in the same company or jumping to other firms, maybe smaller firms. It seems like your role changed a lot, not because you're moving company to company, but because companies were changing dramatically. So, Elisabeth, do some people not need to use those types of services because they're naturally changing if the companies like Royston's been in have moved so much?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's always room for like professional support if you want to show yourself in the best possible light, especially your financial achievements and accomplishments, whether you're advancing externally or internally. Royston had some incredible progression, and I think that a lot of people should look to him from a setting an example perspective, right? And whether someone wants to add more to their plate and set themselves up maybe for like a post-retirement activity, whether that's teaching in academia or serving on a board or starting that younger in their career as like a parallel route so they can pivot quickly if something should happen. I would say those are all very valuable considerations that people can make. I think in today's world, where job security is not a given as much anymore as it was maybe 20, 30, or maybe even 10 years ago, which is really when a lot of companies really retired their last pension plans. We saw a lot of that. I think it's important to stay flexible, to stay nimble, to be able to move around. I don't know if it was you or Royston who said it, but the world is your oyster, right? Treasury people with their finance background, they have a lot to offer. So why put yourself in a box?
Craig, can I just jump in there? I need to add something to what Elisabeth said. It's resonated very much with me. And maybe it's me, but I don't think it is. I do believe that Treasury is that profession that I've certainly grown up with, where we're not, either because of what the nature of what we're like, we're very risk averse, and we've never been, we're not encouraged to be risk takers, rightly so. But I think there's an element in there where we don't tend to sell ourselves very well. And that's been my experience time and time and time again, particularly when people say to me, what exactly is Treasury? And what do you do? And I always kind of scratch my head and think, I mean, less so now today, but certainly 10, 15 years ago, it was hard to kind of answer that question, in a very simple way, or rather without getting too much into the weeds, because quite often people just blank out when you start talk about liquidity management and risk management and, sort of hedge effectiveness. So understood all that. In fact, one of the points I was going to make early on, Craig, is even today, if you think about some of the questionnaires that we have to fill in, whether it's for insurance or for an application, it amazes me how often you never see the different titles for Treasury in there. You'll see financial controller, finance director, financial analyst, you name it, finance is in there. Treasury, very hard. So usually end up going in for something quite kind of esoteric, like Treasury director, or not Treasury, but just director or senior manager or something along those lines. But the point still remains where we don't do a very good job, in my view, of selling ourselves. And it's part of that process, it's part of that service she offers, which is helping people to recognize what they're worth and how to pitch it. And that can be externally as well as internally, because it's how you're going to progress in your career if you're not able to get to that next level, even within your own company.
I would add, if I may, for a quick second to what Royston said, because I see that in my own clients over and over again, right? The not selling themselves as much as they could. And just for perspective, we know from market compensation data, post-COVID, let me back up. Like during COVID, Treasury and finance were really the most highly regarded roles for corporations during COVID because of the liquidity issues that occurred. And as a result of that, the market compensation for Treasury professionals post-COVID jumped. I don't know if it's how it is in the UK, Royston, so you tell me, but in the US, the compensation for treasury professionals for the first time ever jumped higher from an expansion perspective than that of technology professionals, which were always that group that had the largest amount of salary growth. And then post-COVID, treasury and finance overtook that. So I think treasury professionals have a lot more room to be more confident about what they bring to the table. They sometimes also have more negotiation power than they think. So yeah, I agree with everything that was said.
Yeah, some really good points there. I guess the difficult times are good for treasury in a different way. The traditional and new career pathways, lateral moves, as we talk about preparing yourself for either post-regular career or a different pathway, a way to accelerate. What's hard about some of those is, you don't want to move to an area that's boring just to round things out, because mental stimulation may not be so good. And there are some areas of finance that I find fairly boring, right? Maybe you do too. There's also sometimes lateral moves means like when your expenses are growing because you are having kids, you take a lateral move, and so you're stalling your career for a time, and it's an investment for future. Sometimes those can be a challenge. So, any comments on, besides just suck it up and do it, but any thoughts on that?
I would agree with the sometimes suck it up and run with it, because in my experience on having supported senior executives for over a decade in various ways, whether it was in HR or as an executive transition or outplacement provider, in my experience and in their experience, more experience was always better. And sometimes that may be boring, sometimes it may be lateral. But if you want to progress within your own company, there's huge value in understanding the business from different angles versus your own little niche. Whether you are in technology, if you're always going to be a coder and you sit in your cubicle and you write code, eventually you're going to hit the ceiling. But if you step out and you see the business from different angles, you will have more opportunities. So I think that while I agree with you that maybe some areas of finance are maybe not the most sexy and exciting, it's all valuable experience that if you do have those kind of C-level aspirations where you want to become a CFO and grow within the business, having that experience will pay tremendous dividends, because you're rounding out your profile from a specialist niche person to more of a generalist, which means you can plug and play in more areas. So while I understand the sentiment, I would say more experience is always better. And if something were to ever happen with the company where you are facing an exit, it will enable you to pivot into other areas quicker when you go into the external market.
Yeah, good rebuttal to my question. I think, Royston, one of those things about this, gaining experience in other areas and being more diversified, usually we have success in the beginning of our careers by going deep, becoming very technical. That seems to be universal, whether it's accounting, FP&A, treasury. We initially have success by going deeper, not by moving laterally. And so that transition could be hard. I mean, what do you think about that from the pathways perspectives or other skills perspective that may be softer rather than technical?
Everything that's been said so far is spot on in my view, and it's actually very important. So today's world, we live in a world, as we all know, where technology is evolving at exponential pace. And certainly some of my peers have argued quite strongly and quite, with good reason, that putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, particularly some of the automation that's available or possible through technology, means that we're losing sight sometimes of what's behind the technology and how's that process or how's that technical justification for what we're doing, how's it work? And so I agree in respect to what you just said, that on one hand, someone like myself and others that have come through understanding the detail, having worked with the detail, is kind of like a great skill to have. But I also encourage people today, absolutely use technology to its fullest limit, but make sure you understand what's underlying that technology, because it could be a process that one day doesn't work because technology breaks down. Could you still do and complete that process if you need to? So it's important to have the theory. I think this aspect of diversity is very important as well, because I think, unfortunately, it sounds like we're a victim, but not. I think my experience in Treasury is that when we're asked to do something, we don't like saying no. And that invariably means you end up doing some stuff that's not always very exciting or sexy. As I said, the CFOs typically tend to come to Treasurer when it's a task that no other stakeholder, no other senior manager report either has a skill or, more important, is prepared to do it. But that's not a bad thing, because that's why I think it puts Treasury in such a good position, because we're seen as, to some degree, jack of all trades. And we have that sort of ability, that scope, if you like, to take on these additional tasks. One last thing I'll say, and I know we're going to come on to this shortly, about mentorship and sponsorship. It is absolutely vital. And unfortunately, I didn't have this through my career all the way through, but I had pockets of it. Having not just a mentor, because that's important, but a sponsor as well. Because a sponsor can really jettison your career in the ways that we've discussed so far, by getting you the right opportunities, either within the company and, as odd as it might sound, potentially outside the company.
At the end of the day, I would say, yes, I mean, while you're in corporate, there's always someone who has a say over your career, right? Whether you get hired, promoted, or some of the, maybe less fun alternatives. There's always someone having a say. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of it comes back to being the CEO of our own career and driving our own progress. And I think with regards to lateral moves, people who do this in a very savvy kind of way, they don't just take any kind of lateral move, right? They have those conversations with the upper management and their HR leaders around, okay, if I do this for a couple of years, I want to know what comes after that. So I'm not like putting myself in the box. So there's more growth beyond that. And I think that's a really nice tie-in to what Royston said, that in order to have those conversations and for people to have you on the map, you have to have the sponsor, and that is different than having the mentor. The mentor can help you address issues, maybe behaviors where you need to smooth yourself out a little bit. The sponsor is the person who opens doors for you when you're not in the room and speaks on your behalf. Those are the most powerful allies you can have in the business. And it all feeds back into that, be the CEO of your own career and take initiative and make things happen. And if you do take a lateral move to round out your profile, make sure you know what the end destination is. So you're not putting yourself in another box that you may not want to stay in forever.
This sponsorship, having a sponsor, we don't have any, I don't know a lot of companies that have sponsor days. They have mentor programs, right? Find someone you can mentor, find someone who can mentor you, and you take the leadership on there. On the sponsor side, is that how does that work?
Let me jump in. I saw something that really inspired me on TEDx, which I sometimes watch when I see something that's interesting. And if only I'd known this at the beginning of my career. So from what they described a sponsorship would be, and I've seen something very close to it, is it has to be someone who obviously recognizes your value. It usually should be someone who has the authority or the ability to make an impact. And like Elisabeth said, it's typically someone who would be your spokesperson, essentially, behind closed doors, someone who would champion your cause. But that sponsor doesn't necessarily have to be your boss or the treasurer. It could be someone else as a senior manager within the company. As long as, again, it's important that person is able to recognize, because of course you wouldn't expect a sponsor to champion a cause if they didn't think you would add value. There's another aspect to this in terms of sponsor. I'm not sure how people perceive mentors and sponsors anyway, but just say with mentors, it might be, like you said, driven by the company. Whereas with a sponsor, I think it's typically you, like Elisabeth say, you'd be your own CEO. So you'd need to feel confident enough and, in terms of approaching someone you think could be your sponsor and having that discussion with them. And then I'm not an expert on this, but having heard the TEDx, it then talks through what happens if they say no. they say yes, and so on and so forth. But the concept is quite simple. And I don't think anyone would be averse. And I'm sure some people already have someone like that in an unofficial capacity. But to me, it brings in that additional dimension where you're kind of thinking, I want to get ahead. I want to be successful. And these are tools which can really help someone in their career. And we're talking about timing, right? So it's all about how quickly can that be done in the best possible way for yourself.
Yeah, and it's typically not your boss, especially if they're the type who are worried that you might be after their job. So oftentimes it is someone a couple layers up or higher where they don't mind advocating because your rising star is not going to become a concern for themselves. So, yeah.
There's something in that, Elisabeth. I agree with you, but I also am a big fan, and I know it's easy for me to speak in some ways, but I do believe when you look at the concept of leadership, and everyone I've read, and typically the ones that have been successful, have said the same thing. A true leader, wants to make sure that the people beneath them are successful so that they can step back and allow them to lead.
Absolutely.
And we don't see enough of that, in my view.
Exactly.
Is that like being the sponsor then?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I believe everyone can learn something from everyone. And like the example that Royston gave, where I don't know if you mentioned an age, but where someone chose someone who's 29 because they could teach them new things about how technology or how the world works. I think there's tremendous benefits to outside perspective, different insights, different views on the business, learning more about how other generations in the workforce think. So, yeah, I think it's a very enriching experience. So,
yeah, taking a step. As we wrap up, any final thoughts? So you both shared a lot of content, but any last words?
One of the nuggets of gold that I got in my career, and it's an interesting one for me, it was through a mentor I had for a very brief period, where he said, sometimes you have to introduce a bit of tension into your relationship with your line manager. Now, you've got to be careful on how you read that. It doesn't mean to kind of create a fight or be aggressive or cause friction. No, I think, and it certainly worked for me in terms of helping your powers that be sometimes to recognize your true value. Because quite often what can happen if you are always supportive, and obviously you should be, sometimes they can miss the value of having you there as to not having you there. So just bear that in mind, I would say, for your listeners and your viewers. Also, that diversity in operational experience. I remember a CFO saying to me once, one of the key skills or experience he looked for, certainly for people coming from treasury, is having, like, say, a stint in a business unit in one of the smaller businesses. So it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily aspire to being a CFO for the large group, the parent company. You could have a smaller kind of stint in a smaller subsidiary, maybe, where you cut your teeth on the kind of challenges of being a finance director for a small business. But those are usually very, very good experience to have, but also puts you in good stead if you're looking for a CFO role for a large company.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Royston. Elisabeth.
Yeah, I love everything that Royston said. And I'm thinking like what I can add to it, right? And if I look at the clients that we support as a business, director level to C-suite, and I think about how did they get where they are today, there are obviously a lot of things that contribute to a person's career, right? Skill, expertise, obviously a lot of soft skills. But if I had to hone in on the soft skills that I think are the most important in today's workplace, it would be probably the ability to build relationships internally, externally, in new networks in all parts of the business, so that you might be able to get exposure to those roles where you can learn more about the business. And then just generally like intellectual curiosity and really the willingness to take risks, right? With your career, expand, branch out. If you've always been in treasury, like try finance for a little while. If you've always been in finance, try treasury for a little while. Go into that operational role that Royston mentioned. So you get a more well-rounded, holistic view of the business and can then also think differently about the strategy of the business. So I think those are the factors that consistently help people get ahead and broaden their networks, which then unleashes a lot of other synergies with regards to outside opportunities, board, academia involvement, which helps people not just expand, but also accelerate and build those kind of pathways that can lead to another layer of experience past their corporate careers when the time comes.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you, Royston. Really appreciate it.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.